Hello, everybody. Okay. How is everyone tonight? Just to introduce myself for those of you who do not know me. My name is Dr. Jessica Freedman. I am the chair and founder of MedEdits Medical Admissions. I am a former faculty member at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, an emergency physician, and at Mount Sinai, I was involved in many aspects of medical school education, residency leadership. I was on the med school admissions committee, and I served a host of roles there. I founded MedEdits in, late 2007, early 2008, and over the course of the past 17 plus years, we have really created a phenomenal organization with amazing faculty. All of my faculty have admissions experience. We work with students who are at all phases of their educations, from high school students to pre-meds, to medical school applicants, to residency applicants. So we really work with everyone along the entire continuum of medical education. In fact, we work with students throughout their entire educations, which is really amazing. We see them in college, we then see them move on to medical school, we then see them move on to residency and fellowship. So we have many successful practicing physician graduates in the country, and that's really just quite an honor that we've impacted that many lives. So there's a lot of exciting stuff going on right now at MedEdits, and just to sort of review the phases of where everybody is right now. The majority of our medical school applicants have committed to their medical schools. They know where they're attending. We have had phenomenal success this year. 95% of our students who engaged us comprehensively got into medical school, and that is because they worked really hard. They followed all of our direction. They got phenomenal results. We are super proud of them. So most of those students are getting ready to start medical school, sort of enjoying their summers as they get ready. Then we are now working with applicants who are submitting applications this year in 2025, and most of them have submitted their primaries. Many are verified. Some are working on secondary essays. So it's a super exciting time of year as we are getting ready to launch, as we are launching this next application cycle. And we're super excited for all of those students as we see them through this process. We are also starting to work with our residency applicants who are applying for residency in the fall. And so, they're about to start their fourth years, or they have started their fourth years. And, so that's also a really exciting time. And then our residency applicants whom we worked with last year are getting ready to start their internships. Some have obviously started orientations. And so, July 1st is a really big time of year when everyone is starting their internships and their first years of residency. So a lot going on here at MedEdits with different people in different phases of the cycle. So, it's always exciting. Honestly, there's always something happening, which is one of the reasons why I just love what I do. So for those of you who perhaps are visiting for the first time, who maybe are attending this live for the first time, I do about bi-weekly live Q&As on Facebook. I answer all of your questions live, as many as I can possibly get to. If you are a counselor, I'm also happy to answer your questions. We do have some pre-med counselors who tend to join these sessions as well. So, I am here to offer as much information and to have as much valuable discussion as possible. If there's ever something that you ask me and I don't know the answer, I love that, because I love looking up the answers to those questions and seeking out that information, because I can't possibly know absolutely everything. So, so if there's ever anything you ask that I don't know the answer to the question, we will do our absolute best to find the answer to that question. So I see that the questions are coming in. So for those of you who have not been here before, if you just post your questions in the comment section as you are watching this live, I will answer those questions live. The more questions we get, the better, because the more that all of us can learn in this way. And again, if you have a question, I guarantee that many people who are watching this live or who are watching the recording of this live they have those questions as well. So no question is a bad question, in other words. Everyone's in different stages of learning. And I also like to encourage people to think about this. Medical education is a continuum. And so let's say someone asks something about residency, the residency match, and you think, gosh, my child's only a pre-med, I don't need to know about the residency match. You will need to know about the residency match. So this enables people to, kind of really learn about the different stages of the process. And the more informed you are, then, ideally the more successful you can be. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's get started. Okay, so Erin asks, for my work and activity section, I work part-time for a physical therapy office. And part of what they had me do was secondary research on the internal gathering information from scientific journals to be used for pamphlets information. Would I be able to list this under research on my application, or is that too much of a stretch? So let me just summarize this question. So Erin works for a physical therapy office, and as part of her job, she is creating pamphlets based on research that she is doing for patients. And she's asking if that can qualify as research. To me, this does not qualify as research, but what you are doing is so important and so impactful. So the fact that the office has entrusted this to you and that you are doing the work to educate patients so that they are more informed, so that they can understand their physical therapy. Perhaps they can understand the pathophysiology of what their problem is. Perhaps they can understand, more about their treatment and how that treatment is potentially going to improve their problem. To me, what this demonstrates that you are making a real impact in that office. So I think this is really valuable work. And I don't want you to think of it in terms of, gosh, if I'm not able to list this as research, it's not going to mean much. It is. It's valuable work you're doing. And so probably what I would do is I would be writing about the research you're doing, the pamphlets you're creating within the description for this activity itself. And it's valuable. And probably that would be a most meaningful, I would think, for you, which is going to, if you're applying via AMCAS, which is the allopathic application service, and that's going to give you even more space then to write about that experience. I think that sounds great. Deepti asks, do you edit essays and personal statements? Yes, we do. I don't like to talk about services on these lives. I want them really to be informational. So if you do have questions about our services, please email us, info@mededits.com. We'd be happy to have a meeting with you to talk about how we work with students and, how we can help your student. He asks, do you have any insights on the pre-med experiences of Johns Hopkins versus U Chicago? I think both of these are fantastic pre-med institutions. We've worked with students from both of these institutions. Certainly the students who choose to go to Hopkins or Chicago are going to be, a lot of them are going to be really STEM focused. These are intense academic institutions. These are, not schools that inflate grades like many other institutions. Your student's going to be surrounded by very serious pre-meds and a fairly large pre-med community at both of these institutions. What I like about schools like Hopkins and U Chicago is that because they are in urban areas and areas that are underserved and that have major academic institutions affiliated with them, the students who go to school in these areas tend to have a lot of opportunities outside of the classroom, whether that is research, whether that is patient-facing work, whether that is direct clinical work, community service, outreach, civic engagement. Students who attend schools in urban areas really have that to their advantage. And so I like both of these institutions for pre-meds. I don't necessarily prefer one over the other. I would look at geography. These are two geographically very, very different areas. But I think they're both terrific. Both top-notch schools with a lot of pre-meds who are successful, very driven students. Rita asks, how important is volunteering? What makes certain volunteering activities better than others? Volunteering community service is an essential ingredient for pre-meds to get into medical school. Sometimes, when we're working with a student, let's say, who is working with us as they're getting ready to apply to medical school, and, we are trying to help them create the strongest, most powerful documents that they can create. Sometimes students who are lacking community service, they're really missing a key ingredient that makes those documents that impactful. So this is something that, especially if a student is considering allopathic medical schools, MD granting medical schools, if the student does not have community service, volunteering, social justice type of work, then we are potentially going to advise that student to wait to apply because it is that important. In terms of what type of volunteering or community service is most important, that really depends on the student's interests. You will never hear us say that one type of work is the best type of work, because this is all about the student creating their own distinctive narrative and, paving their own path to medical school, and to demonstrate that their interests are organic and that they're linked to one another and that they're not forced. So, for example, the type of community service or volunteer we may recommend for one student is going to be completely different than the type of community service work that we might recommend for another student, because we're always trying to kind of, have students in some way link their interests in a creative way. And that's sometimes what we're doing when we're brainstorming with students in terms of what they should be getting involved with. We're looking at their past experiences. We're looking at the things that are really important to them, the things they're really engaged in. And then we're trying to build on that, by helping them to decide what other experiences they should be getting involved in. Okay. Buvana asks, how do we truly understand what the mission of each medical school is? It seems like many schools say similar things on their homepage. Research-based, culturally humble, clinical experience. How do we understand what is important to each school? Okay, so Buvana asks, how can we distinguish what the mission statement is for every medical school? Because most medical schools' mission statements sound the same. And that is true. They do. They sound the same. Unless you are talking about, let's say, a school like NMed in, the program NMed for engineers and medicine, that obviously has a really strong mission statement. Or if you're talking about a school that focuses on rural medicine, those schools have very, very particular mission statements. But otherwise, you are right. Medical schools are very similar in their mission statements. There's no question about that. And medical school curriculums are all the same, right? There's not much variation in medical school curriculums. It's very different than college, because there's a set curriculum in medical school. So what we generally recommend is that to kind of really get a sense of what's important to a medical school, you look to their secondary essay prompts. The secondary essay prompts are going to address those things that are the most important to the medical school. And what we find in secondary essays, when we're working with students, because we really get our students to compose very, very comprehensive primary applications, sometimes those secondary essay prompts are going to force them to repeat some topics that are addressed in their primary application. But for the medical school, let's say, that really values healthcare inequities, or, understanding the backgrounds of different, populations, they're potentially going to have a secondary essay prompt about that, because their assumption needs to be that the student did not address that topic in their primary application, right? So they're trying to kind of, by asking specific secondary essay prompts, they're trying to fill potential gaps in things that maybe are missing from the primary application. So that's really where you can start to see what's important to a med school if you look to their secondary essay prompts. Do you provide insight guidance for admission to pre-med classes for high school students? We actually, I'm not sure exactly what you're talking about, Vinita, but so if you could email us, info@mededits.com, that would be great. We can answer your question. Okay. Daljit asks, what extracurricular activities do you recommend for a college freshman and the summer before freshman year? Okay, great question. So what activities do we recommend for freshmen and freshmen who have just finished their senior year of high school? Okay, so first of all, It is my strong recommendation that after students graduate from high school, they take a break. I really feel this is important. High school is so high pressured for students now. It's so intensive. Students, once they get to college, they're going to get involved in so many things, and college is busy. It's really busy. So I am really an advocate for taking a break the summer after senior year before you start your freshman year of college, okay? If a student wants to do something, they're sort of somebody who just feels like they have to be doing something, okay? They could get an EMT certification if they haven't done that already. They can always shadow different physicians and gain exposure to different specialties in medicine, because, that's something that's going to be really important, not only as a pre-med, but that's also important as a medical student when you are trying to figure out what specialty you want to pursue if you don't know what specialty you want to pursue. In terms of what students should be doing as freshmen in college, and we do have a free guide, which I will be updating very, very soon. It's our freshman and sophomore free download. You can find it on our website, but I will be updating it. We update everything that we have every year to reflect the trends that we observed in the previous application cycle, right? So now that all our students have kind of wrapped up their application cycles for 2024, 2025, we're compiling kind of what our new observations were for that cycle, because things do shift every year. But the primary things that we want students to be focusing on their freshman year, number one, they need to figure out how they're going to balance their academics, their social life, their extracurricular activities. That takes time. It's important as much as is possible to get a strong start freshman year, because I just feel that that boosts a student's confidence. So you want them to figure out how are they going to balance their studies. What are the courses like at their college? How do they register for classes? Who are their friends going to be? Who are they going to be having dinner with every night? What are they going to be doing on weekends? There's so many different pressures for students freshman year, especially first semester, that we really like them to use that first semester to just sort of settle in, maybe to get involved in some pre-med clubs on campus, talk to other pre-meds, find out what are the common things that students do freshman year. If there is an EMS service, at the student's college, that's something that could be available to freshman students, or that could be something that's only going to be available once students become sophomores, because those do tend to be fairly competitive clubs. But I would start doing some research as to the most popular pre-med clubs on campus and pre-med activities on campus, and get involved in one or two things. Don't overwhelm. The student needs to figure out what their interest is going to be, what they're going to get involved with academically, what their major is going to be, what their niche is going to be. Are they going to potentially be doing research? That kind of all evolves over sophomore, junior, and senior years. So there's no rush, in other words, freshman year to get deeply involved. And sometimes when students do that, it backfires because they're not ready to have that much on their plate. Okay. Is there a better place to find out what secondary questions, maybe to get a head start? Yeah, so you can look up last year's prompts fairly easily. Student Doctor Network is, I find has the most reliable secondary essay prompts, because the students put those up there themselves. So you can go to Student Doctor Network to look at last year's prompts, but we're not that far away now from the first wave of primary applications being sent to medical schools. So that's happening, I believe it's June 27th. So we're not that far away. So this year's secondary essay prompts are going to be released very, very soon. So, most schools don't change their secondary essay prompts from year to year. Every once in a while, there is a surprise. The school that we didn't expect to change them, changes them. But I would look at last year's, threads on Student Doctor Network for school-specific threads to look at those secondary essay prompts from last year, and you can get started on those that way. It's a great question. Lauren, this is so familiar to me. Lauren asks, are you familiar with Camp Bobby Creek in Florida? Is that considered clinical or volunteer? I do know what this is. I have to look it up to remind myself what this is. We have had students who've been involved with this. If you want to put in the chat what it is, that will jog my memory. But yeah, we've definitely have students who have done Boggy Creek in the past. I just can't remember the specifics. Michael asks, regarding doing community service hours, is it okay to do the hours only during summer breaks, or is it better to do it year round? So whenever we're looking at activities and we're making recommendations for students, we're trying to identify a few things. First of all, academics come first. So we never want the student being involved in too much activity so their academic performance is compromised. Students can always take gap years. They can take additional time to gain more valuable experiences, but ideally we don't want to do anything that is going to just directly impact the GPA. So that's number one in terms of how many activities we recommend a student be involved with. Then in terms of how much involvement a student should have in any given activity, we are looking at what is that student most interested in, sort of where are going to be the spikes or the peaks in their experience profile. What are going to be the things that are the most important to that student. So for some students, community service in a very specific area might be one of their most impactful experiences. It might be a place where they made a tremendous impact. And for that student, we're going to recommend that they really double down on that experience. For another student, it might be clinical work that is really their strength. And so for that student, then we might say, okay, get your community service in the summer, because in the summer you're at home and there's something you're involved with at home that you can only do while you're at home, and you're home in the summers. So whatever we're making these recommendations, again, these are all so individualized, and it's different for every student. But certainly, Michael, if your student has a different sort of expertise, for lack of a better word, a different spike, then their valley, right, might be community service, and it might be perfectly fine for them just to do that community service in the summer. Absolutely. Okay. Deepika asks, is it okay for students to ask for a letter of recommendation from doctors at the time they are shadowing working with them? For example, while they're sophomores, but will be applying to medical school during their senior year. Same for professors. If it is a couple years later and they might forget the student? Okay, this is a great question. So Deepika asks, should a student ask for a letter of recommendation at the time that they have that relationship with that professor or that physician whom they're shadowing, or should they wait for 2 years for when they're applying to medical school? So our general recommendation on this is, first of all, for an academic letter, it is probable that the student is not going to need that letter from sophomore year when they actually apply to medical school, if we're talking about an application that's 2 years later. But if they think, they really had meaningful work with this professor, they had a couple of classes, and they're worried they're not going to have any more interaction with that professor between now and when they apply to medical school, they can ask that professor for a letter of recommendation, ask them to write it, either send it to their premed office if the premed office holds those letters, or send it to Interfolio, which is a letter dossier service. But then they keep in touch with that professor. They keep them updated on what they're doing, on how they're doing, on other things they're involved with. And that way, the student can then 2 years later ask them, hey, I know I haven't worked with you in the past 2 years, but would it be possible for you to date my letter in, today, or, now, in, let's say, 2027, and, maybe just add a few sentences about, Sally has kept in touch with me, over the past 2 years since I taught her. So, we always are encouraging students to foster these relationships and to keep people engaged in their success. So to keep in touch with people. And this is really important just in terms of general relationship building, networking. I do find that students of this generation are so good at networking. They're masters at it, but sometimes that's also something that's learned. So sort of, cultivating those habits and those behaviors is a good thing to do starting sophomore year. Okay. How important is study abroad to a student's application? It's not important, honestly. Most pre-meds still do not study abroad. We do work with more students now who study abroad than we used to, but it's not important, honestly. Med schools don't really care about study abroad. Okay. Christina asks, does taking an online course look less favorable? My son is taking Summer Physics 1 with lab offered at his university. He plans to take some Physics 2 during the regular semester. Do you advise that he drop the online course now and take it during the regular semester? Even though it appears like a lot of schools accept it, do you feel there will be a bias in the evaluation? This is a tricky question, Christina, because when a college, so like let's say, I don't know what college he goes to, but whatever college he's going to, if they are offering an online course for their students and they're telling their students this is okay for pre-meds to take, then I would check in with his pre-med office. Have other students taken this Physics 1 online and have they been accepted to medical school? So when something's offered by the institution and it allows the student to progress to the next phase of that sequence, then this shouldn't be a problem. Medical schools would rather a student take in-person classes, especially an in-person lab. So I think that, let's say, if he kept the online lecture component of this class and then did the in-person lab component, that would kind of be, to me, a happy balance here, because it's hard to sort of do labs online. I just don't think that's very effective learning. But I would definitely check with the undergraduate pre-med advising office about this, because I guarantee they've had other students in the exact same situation. If you want to look specifically at which medical schools will accept online classes, you can look at the MSAR, the medical school admissions requirements. That's for allopathic medical schools. But also realize that, many medical schools are going to make exceptions on a case-by-case basis for certain things. So, things aren't so set in stone all the time. That's something else to kind of understand. Okay. Okay, Gianna says, I work as an MA in a float pool. In some clinics, I work very closely with doctors and they allow me to go into patient rooms with them and even help teach me what's going on. Is it okay to count some of those hours as shadowing, or should I count all of those hours as clinical work? The key is to be honest, Gianna. No one ever vets. I've never heard of anybody ever vetting a medical school applicant's application to check if the hours were correct. And also realize that categories don't always matter. So the reason there are write-ups in the medical school application is because whoever's reviewing your application is reading that entire write-up. So I think that you would probably be better off in this situation writing about your medical assistant job, and then within that description, you explain, as part of my work, many physicians, took me under their wing, or I wouldn't use that language, but many physicians allowed me to shadow them and, did bedside teaching with me. And so that way, when someone reads that, they're going to understand that there were shadowing hours built into this activity, built into this experience. And so I wouldn't worry so much about categories. But my fear, if you created a shadowing category, is that it would almost look like you were double dipping, unless you listed the physicians, I guess, and their specialties with the number of hours. But that might be tough to do if they're just sort of saying, hey, if they're just saying, hey, Gianna, there's a really interesting patient here, like just take a few minutes and, come in this room with me so I can teach you something. It's very hard to quantify those hours, in which case I would probably just include that in the description. And this is, this sounds like academic medicine. I mean, this is what happens in academic medicine. So that sounds like a great position if you have that opportunity. It's awesome. Okay. Oh, this is a loaded question. Okay. Jacqueline asks, how do you think medical schools decide who to offer interviews to? It seems like everyone applying has good stats, clinical experience, volunteering, research, etc. Do you think they really read thousands of essays? Is it luck? There's always an element of luck. Always. There's always an element of randomness to any selection process, whether that's college admissions, med school admissions, applying for jobs, who happens to be having a good day when they read your application. There's always an element of randomness to this, but we have to capitalize on the things that are within our control. Based on the past 17 years that I've been doing this, I can tell you that moving and interesting documents earn interviews. This is why we find that at the written medical school application is perhaps, other than interviews, the most important part of this process, because when someone composes meaningful and moving documents that are interesting, even for someone who it tends to skim or who's already read 10 applications and they're just like ready to go to sleep, if they come upon something interesting that they want to read, they're going to read it. So yes, I think, and again, this is based on us and our work with thousands of students, that yes, there's a random component to it, but really outstanding written documents earn interviews. There's no question. And you know, and how what those documents convey is going to vary tremendously depending on the student, because every student has a different mix of experiences and observations. So there are no two documents that are ever the same. And so that's kind of the beauty of it. And that's what makes it interesting. Daljit asks, how critical is research experience? If a student is interested in allopathic MD granting medical schools, research experience is definitely important. Students don't necessarily have to have thousands of hours of research. If a student is interested in an extremely competitive, very, very selective medical school, then research becomes even more important, and we want to see meaningful research if a student is going for a very competitive top-tier medical school. If you're applying to osteopathic medical schools, research becomes much less important. So it depends on what the student's goals are, in large part, when we are advising on research experience. Yes. So Camp Bobby Creep is a medical camp where students volunteer as a camp counselor to work with children with medical issues. I would say, so if a student is volunteering at a medical camp and the camp serves campers who have medical problems. This almost sounds like Camp Kesem as well, which a lot of students are involved with. And Camp Boggy Creek is in Florida. We've definitely had students who have worked there. I would count this as community service volunteering, medical, clinical. And that's valuable. The student is learning about different diagnoses. The student is learning about the challenges that face those campers. There's a lot the student is going to gain from this experience. So this all sounds super valuable to me. Okay. Diva asks, for non-clinical experience in the application, can an applicant put activities relating to their hobbies or interests? Like, for example, teaching Sunday school to kids or having a sport or acting. Absolutely. So, medical schools want to know that you're human. They want to know that you do something other than go to the library and the lab and the clinic. And so we are always encouraging our students to include hobbies and interests. The only time that we don't allow them to do that, or that we don't encourage them to do that, is if they have too many experiences. I can tell you that we've worked with some incredibly overly accomplished students, and everybody has one entry that they can spare for hobbies and interests, and you can merge those. Like, you could just list your hobbies and interests, and that often will create conversation. It makes, it allows the reader and the interviewer to understand that you do things outside of medicine and that you're an interesting person. And that also demonstrates your intellectual curiosity, that you're interested in other things. So absolutely you should do this. Yeah, it's great. Okay. Jed, in the past webinars, you warned against medical schools that offer pass-fail grades. So students have a grade for residency. Hospitals can see a grade. My daughter is thinking, if school is a top 20 med school, then residency consideration should know that pass-fail is going to mean students have done well to pass those classes. Yes, I agree with this. So Jan is asking about pass-fail curriculums for medical school. And there are some medical schools that have been pass-fail for a long, long time, especially the top-tier medical schools, right? So the most competitive medical schools, and I think it's the same thing with law schools, have historically been pass-fail for a very long time. And yes, residency programs know this. And so as long as a student is passing USMLE Step 1, the pass rate for USMLE Step 1, which was taken at the end of the second year of medical school, the pass rate has gone down since that test also went pass-fail. So as long as you're making sure they prepare efficiently and well enough to pass that exam, because now a failure on Step 1, I consider, it was always a very, very, kind of a red mark on an application, but now it's something that's even more difficult to Sorry, I think I just got disconnected. I apologize for that if there was a blip. So I think if you go to a top tier medical school that is pass-fail and has been pass-fail for a while, and you look at their match history and they still have a fantastic match history, I agree with your daughter. There's nothing to worry about there. This consideration is more an issue, in my opinion, for schools that maybe don't have, those outstanding match histories, and students are aiming to get into a top residency program, perhaps one that medical school does not have much of a history of matching in, and then they have fewer data points where they can really distinguish themselves. That's when I think it really becomes a bigger issue. It's a great question. Okay. Does virtual paid research add value to a student's resume? I mean, it depends. I'm never a fan of pay-to-play research. I think for high school, you can get away with that because, generally speaking, college admissions officers don't necessarily know what a valuable research project is. But when you're talking about med school admissions, there's a little more scrutiny when it comes to evaluating a student's experiences. So I would probably stay away, for the purposes of med school, I would stay away from virtual paid research opportunities. To add to a resume, I think it's fine to do that if a student just is really interested in something and wants to do that for their own personal development, but I certainly wouldn't do that because you think it's somehow going to add to their candidacy or improve their chances of getting into med school. It's a good question. Joel asks, what is the typical range of GPA scores for students accepted to medical school? Huge range. And you can look at the MSAR medical school admissions requirements, to look at what that range is. But it's a pretty big range. Generally speaking, assuming a student has an upward trend in the last, 2 years and certainly 3 semesters at least of grades were within the 3.8 plus range. I mean, we've had students who get in with GPAs, 3.5, even lower than that, depending. If a student has a really high MCAT to balance a relatively lower GPA, that's going to make a difference. If a student, had a really difficult major, that's notoriously difficult for getting high grades in, that's taken into consideration. If a student went to a college that is known to have grade deflation, that's taken into consideration. The time when we start to get worried is if the GPA is on the lower end, so a 3.4, 3.5-ish, and if the MCAT is also on the low end. That's when we start to get worried. In general, many colleges have grade inflation now. We see incredibly high GPAs. So I think that the GPA on the high end is in some way becoming less important. I think the MCAT is becoming the more important metric. But again, there's so much individuality in all of this, and everything is really in med school admissions looked at holistically. I mean, we had a student who had, I think, a near 4.0 last year and had an average MCAT of, I think, a 511 over 2 scores. That was the average, and is going to a top 10 medical school. So they had other distinguishing features with regards to their candidacy, and they were a great interviewee. So, there are just so many different pieces of this puzzle that it's so hard to sort of, identify one thing that has to be there to have success. It's about balance. Are 7 to 8 year BSMD college programs better than the traditional 4+ MCAT route? That's a totally personal decision. So BSMD programs are often going to be affiliated with less rigorous, less academic undergraduate institutions. And for a lot of students, that's not what they want. So when you are looking at BSMD programs, you have to decide, is that the kind of college your student wants to go to? Additionally, the MD programs that are affiliated with many BSMD programs are not high-ranked medical schools. They're not your top-tier medical schools. So the student has to ask themselves, do I want to go the traditional college route so that I have a shot at getting into a top medical school? So these are such personal decisions. There's no better or worse. It's about what's important to you and your student. Good questions tonight. Christine, I think I answered this question before about scribing hours broken up into shadowing. And so if you could just go back and watch and listen to the answer to that. It was the same question, but with regards to a medical assistant. Okay. All right. I think, and I knew I've also addressed this question too as well. And so I think that if you go back and you watch our recording, you can get the answer to that question as well. Sorry. I told you, everyone has the same questions and concerns, which I love. What are your thoughts regarding a student taking a gap year before going to medical school? The majority of students are now taking gap years. Only 25% of students are going straight through to med school from undergrad. So, and the reasons for that are there are a lot of reasons why this is happening. Some students think they have to have a gap year in order to be competitive. But for most students, I think that is just as simply, it's too much of a time crunch to get everything in that is necessary to be a competitive applicant regarding taking classes, taking the MCAT, getting the experiences that a student wants to have in order to be a competitive medical school applicant. So I wouldn't say there's better or worse. I can also tell you that the traditional applicants whom we work with, so the students who do apply at the end of junior year, have phenomenal results. These tend to be students who are just very, very high achievers, who are able to have so many responsibilities at this simultaneously, and they're able to do really well academically and really excel in their outside experiences as well. But this year, our traditional students got into phenomenal medical schools. So, I don't like people thinking they have to take a gap year. They don't. I also find that medical schools are now kind of more understanding, and they take into consideration more deeply whether a student is a junior versus has taken a gap year or 2 or 3. And I think as a result of that, they are more appreciative of students who are able to accomplish so much in only 3 years. I think that several years ago, medical schools weren't paying as much attention to sort of where somebody was relative to their age and what they had accomplished, and really looking at that balance. Okay. All right, let me just see if there are any other questions I can just answer quickly. Deepti asked, how can I access past recordings? All of the Q&As should be in the workspace, but Facebook is now starting to delete Q&As, so we may be posting them now on YouTube so that everyone can watch them. So I think that's going to be all for tonight. I thank you so much for being here. I'll be back next week. So there's another Q&A next Thursday for the month of June. For everyone who is submitting, if you haven't submitted yet, we like you to be submitted by the end of June. For everyone who's verified, congratulations. For everyone who has decided on their medical school, congratulations. And I'll see you all back here in a week. And thank you so much for being here. And if you have any questions in the meantime, post them in the Facebook group. I'm on there every single day. And I hope you all have a terrific weekend. Good night.